Welcome to Life Stories, where we share powerful tales of love, redemption, and resilience. Today's story takes us into the lives of Andrew and Emma, two individuals from vastly different worlds whose paths cross under heartbreaking circumstances. What begins as a tale of betrayal and hardship evolves into a journey of forgiveness, second chances, and the unyielding strength of a mother's love. Can broken hearts find healing? And can past mistakes pave the way for a brighter future? Stay tuned as we uncover this moving story of hope and transformation. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey. Andrew and Charlotte were known as one of the most prominent couples in Manhattan. Their opulent lifestyle, characterized by their penthouse apartment with breathtaking views of Central Park and their luxurious dinner parties, was the envy of many. Their wealth and influence seemed limitless, with Andrew being a successful businessman and Charlotte a former model turned socialite. To the outside world, they were the picture of success and sophistication. However, behind the closed doors of their penthouse, their marriage was far from the fairy tale it appeared to be. Andrew and Charlotte's union had been arranged by their wealthy families, a calculated move to merge two powerful business empires. From the beginning, love had played no part in their marriage. It was a contract, a transaction that suited their parents' ambitions more than their own desires. Over the years, this lack of genuine connection became glaringly obvious. Their interactions were cold and transactional, their conversations laced with subtle jabs and resentment. 15 years of marriage had done little to bridge the emotional gap between them. Both Andrew and Charlotte were proud and stubborn, unwilling to compromise or admit their faults. Andrew, a man deeply tied to tradition and family expectations, often found himself frustrated by Charlotte's modern outlook on life. Charlotte, on the other hand, saw Andrew as rigid and emotionally unavailable, someone who valued legacy and reputation over personal happiness. The strain in their relationship deepened when Andrew's family began pressuring him to produce an heir. As the only son, he bore the responsibility of continuing the family name and preserving the wealth that generations before him had built. His parents' inquiries became increasingly frequent and insistent, leaving Andrew restless and anxious. One evening, as the city lights flickered outside their penthouse windows, Andrew decided to confront Charlotte about having children. The atmosphere in the dining room was as cold as the untouched plates of food before them. Charlotte sat flipping through a fashion magazine, her disinterest in the conversation palpable. "Charlotte," Andrew began, his voice low but tense, "we've been married for 15 years. My family won't stop asking when we'll have a child. It's time we talked about it." Charlotte glanced up briefly, a faint smirk playing on her lips. "A child? Now? Why would I want to ruin my body for that?" she retorted, her tone icy. "I've worked hard to maintain this figure. Andrew, I'm not about to throw it away." Andrew stared at her, stunned by her callousness. "This isn't just about appearances, Charlotte. It's about our family, our legacy. Don't you understand how important this is?" "Important to whom?" Charlotte shot back, her voice rising. "Your parents, your business associates. Certainly not to me. I didn't marry you to play the dutiful wife. I married you because it suited both of us. Let's not pretend otherwise." Andrew's frustration boiled over. He slammed his hand on the table, rattling the crystal glasses. "You care more about your image than this family's future. Is that all that matters to you?" Charlotte stood, her chair scraping against the marble floor as she pushed it back. Her eyes were sharp and unyielding. "Don't raise your voice at me, Andrew. I'm not one of your employees. If you're so desperate for a child, find someone else to have one for you. I'm not interested." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Andrew alone in the dimly lit dining room. His hands trembled as he stared at the empty space where Charlotte had been moments before. Their conversation had not only failed to bring them closer but had also cemented the deep chasm between them. In the following weeks, the tension in their home grew unbearable. They avoided each other as much as possible, retreating into separate bedrooms, a habit they had maintained for years. Charlotte buried herself in her social calendar, attending gala events and charity luncheons, her every move chronicled by society photographers. Andrew, on the other hand, found solace in his work, spending long hours at his office and distracting himself with casual flings. Their penthouse became a silent battlefield, their once shared life reduced to parallel existences under the same roof. Andrew's desperation to fulfill his family's expectations weighed heavily on him. Despite his anger toward Charlotte, he couldn't ignore the deep yearning for something more, a sense of purpose, of belonging, that no amount of wealth or success could provide. He began to question the choices that had led him to this point, the sacrifices he had made in the name of duty and tradition. But for all his introspection, he saw no way out of the cold and loveless marriage he was trapped in. Charlotte, too, felt the strain, though she would never admit it. She had built a life around appearances, but beneath her polished exterior was a growing dissatisfaction with her role as a mere accessory in Andrew's world. She resented the expectations placed upon her, the unspoken rules she was forced to follow. Yet her pride kept her from confronting her own unhappiness. Instead, she wielded her independence like a weapon, refusing to bend to anyone's will, especially Andrew's. Their marriage, once a symbol of unity and power, had become a hollow shell, its foundation cracked by years of mutual neglect and resentment. The story of Andrew and Charlotte was not just about a failing relationship but about the profound emptiness that comes from prioritizing image and ambition over love and connection. Unbeknownst to them, their lives were on the brink of a series of events that would force them to confront their choices and the consequences that followed. As the icy silence between Andrew and Charlotte deepened, a shift occurred in their household. Charlotte, tired of the constant tension and Andrew's increasing irritability, decided to hire additional help to manage the penthouse. Among the candidates sent by an agency was Emma, a young woman from a modest background. At 22, Emma carried a quiet strength despite her circumstances. She was soft-spoken, diligent, and unassuming, the kind of presence Charlotte thought would stay in the background and follow orders without fuss. Emma had taken the job out of sheer desperation. Her mother, battling a severe illness, required expensive treatment that Emma couldn't afford on her own. Though the thought of working in such a grand, imposing home intimidated her, Emma saw the opportunity as a lifeline. For her, failure was not an option. When she arrived at the penthouse for her first day, she marveled at the sprawling luxury around her. Yet beneath the surface, the air was thick with tension, a coldness that was hard to ignore. Charlotte wasted no time in introducing Emma to her duties, which included cleaning the separate bedrooms of both Andrew and Charlotte, a task that would eventually make Emma an unwitting messenger between the two. Emma quickly noticed the lack of warmth in the household. Charlotte issued commands with precision, treating Emma like an invisible presence, while Andrew barely acknowledged her at first. It didn't take long for Andrew to notice Emma's quiet competence. She worked tirelessly, meeting the impossibly high standards of the penthouse with ease. Her resilience and dedication stood in stark contrast to the life of indulgence and privilege that surrounded her. At first, Andrew's attention was innocent, a casual curiosity about the new maid. But as the days turned into weeks, his glances lingered, his tone softened when addressing her. Emma began to feel his presence in ways that unsettled her, though she tried to brush off her unease. One evening, as Emma was dusting the intricate bookshelves in Andrew's study, he appeared at the doorway, leaning casually against the frame. "You've been doing a fine job, Emma," he said, his voice low and smooth. "This place hasn't looked this polished in a long time." Emma paused, turning to face him with a nervous smile. "Thank you, sir. I'm just trying to do my best." Andrew stepped further into the room, his gaze fixed on her. "It's nice to have someone who listens, who takes pride in their work. Not everyone here does." His words, though seemingly benign, carried an undertone that made Emma's stomach churn. She nodded politely and excused herself, eager to escape the sudden intensity of his presence. Despite her efforts to avoid him, Andrew found ways to corner her when Charlotte wasn't around. His charm, which masked a deeper predatory nature, grew more persistent. Emma, bound by her need to keep the job, struggled to maintain her boundaries. She told herself that if she stayed professional, everything would be fine. But one night, her worst fears came true. The penthouse was quiet, with Charlotte away at a social event. Emma was cleaning the kitchen when Andrew entered, his footsteps deliberate. "Emma," he said softly, his voice sending a shiver down her spine. She turned, clutching the edge of the counter for support. "You don't have to be afraid of me. I just want to talk," he said, stepping closer. Before she could react, he grabbed her arm. His grip was firm, and the predatory look in his eyes left no doubt about his intentions. Emma's pleas for him to stop fell on deaf ears as Andrew violated her trust and dignity in a moment that would haunt her forever. Afterward, Andrew issued a chilling threat: "If you tell anyone, you'll regret it. I'll ruin you. You'll lose this job, and no one will ever hire you again." Emma, shattered and terrified, had no choice but to stay silent. She couldn't afford to lose the income that was keeping her mother alive. Swallowing her pain, she returned to her duties. But her once quiet strength began to crack under the weight of her trauma. Weeks later, Emma's world crumbled further when she discovered she was pregnant. Alone in her small quarters, she stared at her growing belly, overwhelmed by fear and uncertainty. The father of her child was the man who had stolen her dignity, and the house she worked in had become a prison of secrets. As her pregnancy progressed, Emma struggled to hide the changes in her body. She wore loose clothing and avoided Andrew as much as possible. But she knew the truth would eventually come to light. And when it did, the consequences would be devastating not just for her, but for everyone in the house. As the weeks went by, Emma's secret became harder to conceal. Her once slender figure began to change, her movements slower and more deliberate. The loose clothing she wore could only hide so much, and soon the whispers among the other staff in the penthouse began. For Emma, each day was a delicate balancing act, maintaining her duties while carrying the weight of her secret and the growing fear of what would happen when it came to light. Andrew, wrapped up in his own world of business deals and the hollow facade of his marriage, failed to notice the subtle changes in Emma. For him, the incident that had destroyed Emma's sense of safety was nothing more than a fleeting indulgence, quickly pushed to the back of his mind. But Emma could never forget. Every time she passed Andrew in the penthouse, she felt a wave of dread, her heart racing as she struggled to maintain her composure. The breaking point came one evening when Charlotte hosted a gathering at the penthouse. The room was filled with Manhattan's elite socialites, businessmen, and media personalities. Emma moved quietly through the crowd, serving drinks and hors d'oeuvres, trying to keep a low profile. But the sharp eyes of Charlotte's inner circle noticed the subtle swell of her belly. It was a woman named Diana, known for her sharp tongue and penchant for gossip, who first voiced what others had only whispered. "Charlotte," Diana said, leaning in conspiratorially, "have you noticed your maid? She looks like she's put on some weight. Could she be, pregnant?" Charlotte froze, her eyes narrowing as she processed the remark. At first, she dismissed the idea as absurd. But as the evening wore on, her gaze followed Emma more closely. There was something different about the way the young maid moved, a carefulness that Charlotte hadn't noticed before. By the end of the night, the seed of suspicion had taken root. The next morning, Charlotte called Emma into her room. Sitting on a chaise lounge, her posture rigid, Charlotte fixed Emma with an icy stare. "Are you hiding something from me, Emma?" she asked, her tone as cold as the penthouse's marble floors. Emma's hands trembled as she stood before her employer. "No," she stammered, lowering her eyes. Charlotte's voice grew sharper. Don't lie to me. I've been watching you. Something is going on. Tell me, are you pregnant? The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Emma's breath hitched. And for a moment, she considered denying it. But there was no point. Her secret was too obvious now. And Charlotte's sharp intuition had already pieced together the truth. Yes. Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. Charlotte's eyes widened in shock. And for a brief moment, silence filled the room. But the silence was short-lived. Who is the father? Charlotte demanded, her voice laced with fury. Tell me the truth. Emma remained silent, her lips trembling. She couldn't bring herself to say the words that would implicate Andrew. But her silence spoke volumes. Charlotte's mind raced, connecting the dots, the separate bedrooms, Andrew's recent aloofness. And now this. The realization struck her like a thunderclap. It was Andrew. Wasn't it? Charlotte hissed, her voice low and venomous. Emma's eyes darted away. But her silence was all the confirmation Charlotte needed. Rage consumed Charlotte. Her hands trembled as she pointed toward the door. Get out of my house. I don't care where you go. But I never want to see your face again. You're fired. Emma's heart sank. Please. She pleaded, tears streaming down her face. I have nowhere else to go. My mother is sick. And I need this job to pay for her treatment. Charlotte's expression hardened, unmoved by Emma's desperation. That's not my problem. You can take your sob story somewhere else. Leave now. Or I'll call security. Emma had no choice but to comply. She packed her few belongings and left the penthouse that had been her prison. The bustling streets of Manhattan felt overwhelming as she wandered aimlessly, clutching her meager possessions and battling the fear that consumed her. She had lost her job, her home, and her only source of stability. The weight of her unborn child and her sick mother's plight bore down on her as she tried to figure out what to do next. As days turned into weeks, Emma's life spiraled into despair. Her mother passed away, her illness worsening without the treatment Emma could no longer afford. Alone and grieving, Emma faced the harsh reality of her situation. She was carrying a child she hadn't chosen. A child fathered by a man who had treated her as disposable. And yet, as the life inside her grew, so did her resolve. She would survive for her baby, if not for herself. Little did Emma know. Her departure would set off a chain of events that would force Andrew and Charlotte to confront the fractured lives they had built, unraveling their carefully curated world of wealth and appearances. Life outside the penthouse was a harsh reality for Emma. Manhattan, with its towering skyscrapers and relentless pace, seemed more imposing now than ever. Homeless and jobless, Emma clung to her dwindling resources, trying to make sense of her new life. Her growing belly was a constant reminder of her vulnerability, but it was also her motivation. She wasn't just surviving for herself anymore, she was fighting for her unborn child. Emma took to the streets, selling small goods she managed to procure from thrift shops and street vendors. Each day, she walked the crowded sidewalks, weaving through tourists and locals, calling out to anyone who might buy her wares. Her once soft hands grew calloused, and her feet ached from endless hours of walking. But Emma refused to give up. She would do whatever it took to ensure her child had a chance at life. Despite her determination, the weight of her circumstances bore heavily on her. Nights were the hardest. Alone in a small, shared room in a shelter, Emma would stare at the ceiling, replaying the events that had led her to this moment. She thought of Andrew, the man who had taken so much from her, and Charlotte, whose cold dismissal had sealed her fate. Bitterness threatened to consume her, but she held on to the faint hope that her child's arrival would bring some semblance of light into her life. Months passed, and Emma gave birth to triplets, 3 beautiful boys who were her spitting image. Naming them Elijah, Noah, and Micah, she found a renewed sense of purpose in their tiny faces. Though her days were filled with struggle, Emma's love for her sons gave her strength. Every smile, every coo reminded her why she endured the unrelenting hardship. Raising triplets on her own, however, was an enormous challenge. Emma's earnings barely covered the cost of food, clothing, and diapers. She often went without meals herself to ensure her boys were fed. She carried them on her back and in her arms as she navigated the streets, trying to sell her goods to drivers stuck in traffic. Her life was a constant hustle, a never-ending fight for survival. One sweltering summer afternoon, Emma was weaving through gridlocked traffic, her boys perched in a small, second-hand stroller she had managed to acquire. She called out to drivers, her voice hoarse from hours of effort, when she heard a voice from one of the sleek black cars nearby. "You there, young woman," the voice called. "Come here." Emma froze, her heart pounding. The voice was unmistakable. Turning toward the car, she saw Andrew sitting in the back seat, his sharp features partially obscured by the tinted window. For a moment, the world around her seemed to blur. Memories of the penthouse, of his betrayal, and of her abrupt dismissal came rushing back with a force that nearly knocked the breath out of her. Andrew, too, seemed stunned. He hadn't expected to see Emma again, let alone under such circumstances. His eyes drifted from her face to the three boys in the stroller, and a realization struck him with the weight of a tidal wave. The children bore his unmistakable features, his strong jawline, his dark eyes, his very essence reflected in their young faces. "Emma," Andrew said as he stepped out of the car, his voice a mixture of shock and hesitation. "These, are they?" "Yes," Emma replied sharply, cutting him off. Her tone was firm, but her voice wavered with emotion. "They're yours." Andrew's expression shifted from disbelief to something deeper, guilt. Perhaps even shame. He took a step closer, but Emma instinctively moved to shield her children. "Stay back," she warned, her protective instincts overriding her fear. "Emma, I didn't know," Andrew began, his voice cracking. "If I had, you didn't care to know," Emma interrupted, her eyes blazing with anger. "You left me to fend for myself. You let Charlotte throw me out like I was nothing. Don't you dare pretend to care now." Andrew stood there, silent and visibly shaken. For the first time, he truly saw the consequences of his actions, not just Emma's hardship but the lives of the three boys who looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "I want to make it right," Andrew said after a long pause. "Please, let me help. Let me be a part of their lives." Emma's laughter was bitter. "Help? Be a part of their lives? After everything you did? Why should I trust you? Andrew, you've done nothing but hurt me." Andrew's gaze softened, his posture defeated. "Because I've changed. Emma, I know I've been selfish, and I know I've wronged you in ways I can never undo. But I want to try. I want to be better for them." Emma's heart wavered as she looked at her sons, then back at Andrew. Could she allow him a chance to make amends? Or was it too late for redemption? For the first time in years, Emma felt the faintest flicker of hope, tempered by the scars of her past. The choice before her was daunting, and the path uncertain. But she knew that whatever decision she made, it wouldn't just shape her life, it would shape her son's future as well. Emma stood there in the oppressive heat of the Manhattan summer, her sons clinging to her skirts and gazing curiously at the man who claimed to be their father. The moment was heavy, filled with unspoken tension, anger, and regret. Emma's heart raced as she tried to decide what to do. Every instinct screamed at her to walk away, to protect herself and her children from further harm. But something in Andrew's demeanor stopped her. He seemed different, less composed, less certain, and, most surprisingly, vulnerable. "Why now?" Emma finally asked, her voice breaking the silence. "Why do you care now? Andrew, you didn't care when it mattered. When I needed you." Andrew hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "I was blind, Emma," he said softly, "caught up in my own world. My pride. And my mistakes. But seeing you here. Seeing them, his voice faltered as he looked at the triplets, it's made me realize what I've lost. I don't expect you to forgive me. But I want to try to make it right. I want to help. Emma's anger flared. Her pain bubbling to the surface. Help. You think you can just walk back into our lives and fix everything with your money? Do you have any idea what we've been through? What I've been through? My mother died. Andrew. I lost everything because of you. Tears streamed down her face. But she refused to let them weaken her resolve. She tightened her grip on the stroller, ready to turn and leave. But then she looked down at her sons, Elijah, Noah, and Micah. They were too young to understand the gravity of the moment. But their innocent faces were filled with curiosity and a hint of hope. They deserved to know where they came from. To have the chance at a better life than the one Emma had fought so hard to provide. You say you've changed, Emma said, her voice trembling. Prove it. Not to me, but to them. They're the only reason I'm even considering this. Andrew nodded, his eyes earnest. I will. Emma. I promise you. I'll do whatever it takes. The days that followed were tentative and filled with unease. Andrew began to visit Emma and the boys regularly, often bringing gifts of food, clothing, and toys. At first, Emma viewed these gestures with suspicion. She had learned the hard way not to trust easily, especially when it came to Andrew. But she couldn't deny the relief these contributions brought. For the first time in years, she didn't have to worry about where their next meal would come from or how she would clothe her growing boys. The triplets, cautious at first, gradually warmed to Andrew. He made an effort to connect with them on their level, playing games, reading stories, and listening to their excited chatter. Elijah, the oldest and most observant, often watched Andrew with quiet curiosity, while Noah, the boldest, tested his patience with endless questions. Micah, the gentlest of the three, was the first to shyly call him Dad. Emma watched these interactions from a distance, her emotions a tangled web of hope and fear. She couldn't deny the sincerity she saw in Andrew's efforts. But the scars he had left ran deep. Every time she began to soften toward him, memories of his betrayal would resurface, pulling her back into doubt. One evening, as the boys slept in their small shared room, Andrew approached Emma in the tiny living area of her modest apartment. The room was dimly lit, the sounds of the bustling city filtering in through the window. Emma, Andrew began, his voice hesitant but determined. I know I've caused you more pain than I can ever make up for. But I want to do more. I want to give you and the boys a better life. Emma crossed her arms, her expression guarded. And what does that mean? Andrew, another handout? Another grand gesture to ease your guilt? No, he said, shaking his head. I want you to come back to the penthouse with the boys. You deserve better than this. Emma. They deserve better. Emma's breath caught. The thought of returning to the place where her life had fallen apart filled her with a mix of dread and longing. I don't know if I can do that, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Andrew stepped closer, his eyes earnest. I know it's hard. But things are different now. I'm different. Please. Let me prove it. For a long moment, Emma said nothing, her mind racing. She had fought so hard to build a life for her sons, and the thought of risking their newfound stability terrified her. But as she looked into Andrew's eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen before, genuine remorse, and a desire to change. All right, she said finally, her voice firm but cautious. But this is your one chance. Andrew. If you hurt us again, you'll never see us again. Do you understand? Andrew nodded, his expression resolute. I understand. I won't let you down. As Emma prepared to take the tentative step back into Andrew's world, she knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. Trust was not something she could give lightly, but for the sake of her sons, she was willing to try. Emma returned to the penthouse with a mix of trepidation and cautious optimism. The boys, Elijah, Noah, and Micah were wide-eyed with wonder as they stepped into the grand space that was now their home. The luxury of the place was overwhelming: polished marble floors, towering ceilings, and rooms filled with things they could never have imagined. For Emma, however, the opulence brought back memories of pain and betrayal, making her hesitant to feel any comfort in her surroundings. Andrew had gone to great lengths to prepare for their arrival. The boys each had their own room, decorated with vibrant colors, books, and toys. For the first time, they had beds of their own and a space to call their own. Their laughter echoed through the halls as they explored their new world, their innocence momentarily eclipsing the shadows of the past. Despite her reservations, Emma couldn't deny the boys' joy. Seeing them happy made her heart ache with a mixture of relief and fear. She had made the decision to return for them, but she knew that trusting Andrew again would be the hardest challenge she'd ever faced. Andrew, for his part, was determined to prove he had changed. He spent every moment he could with the boys, reading them bedtime stories, helping with their schoolwork, and playing games in the penthouse's spacious living area. Slowly, he began to forge a bond with his sons, who were starting to accept him as part of their lives. For Emma, however, trust did not come as easily. She watched Andrew closely, her guard never fully lowered. Though he apologized repeatedly for his past actions, Emma knew words alone could never erase the pain he had caused. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, she began to see a genuine effort in his behavior. He was patient, attentive, and willing to listen, qualities she had never associated with him before. One evening, after the boys had gone to bed, Andrew found Emma sitting alone on the balcony overlooking the glittering Manhattan skyline. The night air was cool, and Emma clutched a blanket around her shoulders as she gazed out at the city. "Mind if I join you?" Andrew asked, his tone tentative. Emma shrugged, her eyes never leaving the view. "Suit yourself." He pulled up a chair beside her, the silence between them heavy but not as hostile as it had once been. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the distant hum of the city filling the space between them. "I know it's not easy for you to be here," Andrew said finally, "and I know I've given you every reason to doubt me." Emma turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You're right about that." Andrew nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands. "But I meant what I said. Emma, I want to make things right. Not just for the boys, but for you too. I've been thinking a lot about the past, about how blind I was to what mattered. And I'm sorry, truly sorry, for everything I put you through." Emma studied him, searching for any hint of insincerity. What she saw surprised her. The man before her was not the cold, arrogant figure she had known, but someone who seemed genuinely regretful. "It's going to take more than an apology," she said quietly. "I've heard words before, Andrew. What I need is proof. Proof that you're not going to walk away when things get hard." "You have my word," Andrew said. "I'll spend the rest of my life proving it to you." As much as Emma wanted to believe him, the scars of the past held her back. But for the sake of her sons, she was willing to give him the chance he so desperately sought. Not everyone welcomed the changes in Andrew's life. Charlotte, oblivious to his growing relationship with Emma and the boys, continued her life of indulgence, unaware of the seismic shift happening behind closed doors. But Andrew knew he couldn't keep the truth hidden forever. His marriage to Charlotte, a hollow arrangement built on appearances, was crumbling. He had come to realize that in order to move forward, he would need to confront her and put an end to their charade. One afternoon, as the boys played in the penthouse, Andrew approached Emma with a determined look. "I need to end this," he said, his voice resolute. "End what?" Emma asked, though she already knew the answer. "My marriage to Charlotte," Andrew said firmly. "It's not real. And it never was. I want to be free to build a real family with you and the boys." Emma's heart raced at his words. She had never expected this. Not even in her most optimistic moments. "Are you sure?" she asked cautiously. "What if she refuses? What if it gets ugly?" "I don't care anymore," Andrew replied. "I've spent too long caring about appearances. About what other people think. It's time I put that behind me." Emma nodded slowly. Her heart conflicted. She wanted to believe in Andrew's resolve. But she knew that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. For the sake of her sons. And perhaps even herself. She hoped he was ready to face them. In the end, Andrew's determination to change proved stronger than the ghosts of his past. After a bitter legal battle, he ended his loveless marriage with Charlotte and committed himself to building a life with Emma and their 3 sons. It wasn't an easy road, trust took time. And scars didn't heal overnight, but together, they worked to create a family rooted in love, respect, and forgiveness. The boys thrived in their new home, their laughter filling the once empty halls of the penthouse. Emma, though hesitant at first, found herself opening her heart again, not just to Andrew but to the possibility of a brighter future. This story reminds us that while we cannot undo the past, we can choose to grow, to make amends, and to build something beautiful out of brokenness. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring tales of love, redemption, and resilience.